Chapter 8 of Daniel Boone by John S.C. Abbott. This recording is in the public domain. Recorded by Allison Hester. Chapter 8. Captivity and Flight. The following well authenticated account of the adventures of a ranger is so graphically described in Brown's History of Illinois that we give it in the words of the writer. Thomas Higgins, a native Kentuckian, was, in the summer of 1814, stationed in a blockhouse 8 miles south of Greenville, in what is now Bond County, Illinois. On the evening of the 30th of August, 1814, a small party of Indians, having been seen prowling around the station, Lieutenant Journay, with all of his men, 12 only in number, sallied forth the next morning, just before daybreak, in pursuit of them. They had not proceeded far on the border of the prairie before they were in an ambuscade of 70 or 80 savages. At the first fire, the lieutenant and 3 of his men were killed. 6 fled to the fort under cover of the smoke, for the morning was sultry, and the air being damp, the smoke from the guns hung like a cloud over the scene. But Higgins remained behind to have one more pull at the enemy, and to avenge the death of his companions. He sprang behind a small elm scarcely sufficient to protect his body, when the smoke partly rising discovered to him a number of Indians, upon whom he fired and shot down the foremost one. Concealed still by the smoke, Higgins reloaded, mounted his horse, and turned to fly, when a voice, apparently from the grass, hailed him with, "Tom, you won't leave me, will you?" He turned immediately around, and seeing a fellow soldier by the name of Burgess lying on the ground, wounded and gasping for breath, replied, "No, I will not leave you. Come along." "I can't come," said Burgess. "My leg is all smashed to pieces." Higgins dismounted, and taking up his friend, whose ankle had been broken, was about to lift him on his horse, when the animal, taking fright, darted off in an instant, and left them both behind. "This is too bad," said Higgins, "but don't fear. You hop off on your 3 legs, and I will stay behind you and the Indians and keep them off. Get into the tallest grass and creep as near the ground as possible." Burgess did so, and escaped. The smoke, which had hitherto concealed Higgins, now cleared away, and he resolved if possible to retreat. To follow the track of Burgess was most expedient. It would, however, endanger his friend. He determined, therefore, to venture boldly forward, and if discovered, to secure his own safety by the rapidity of his flight. On leaving a small thicket in which he had sought refuge, he discovered a tall, portly savage near by, and 2 others in the direction between him and the fort. He started, therefore, for a little rivulet near, but found one of his limbs failing him, it having been struck by a ball in the first encounter, of which till now he was scarcely conscious. The largest Indian pressed close upon him, and Higgins turned round 2 or 3 times in order to fire. The Indian halted and danced about to prevent his taking aim. He saw that it was unsafe to fire at random, and perceiving 2 others approaching, knew he must be overpowered unless he could dispose of the forward Indian first. He resolved, therefore, to halt and receive his fire. The Indian raised his rifle, and Higgins, watching his eye, turned suddenly as his finger pressed the trigger, and received the ball in his thigh. He fell, but rose immediately and ran. The foremost Indian, now certain of his prey, loaded again, and with the other 2 pressed on. They overtook him. He fell again, and as he rose the whole 3 fired, and he received all their balls. He now fell and rose a 3rd time, and the Indians, throwing away their guns, advanced upon him with spears and knives. As he presented his gun at one or another, each fell back. At last the largest Indian, supposing his gun to be empty, from his fire having been thus reserved, advanced boldly to the charge. Higgins fired, and the savage fell. He had now 4 bullets in his body, an empty gun in his hand, 2 Indians unharmed as yet before him, and a whole tribe but a few yards distant. Any other man would have despaired. Not so with him. He had slain the most dangerous of the three, and having but little to fear from the others, began to load his rifle. They raised a savage whoop and rushed to the encounter. A bloody conflict now ensued. The Indians stabbed him in several places. Their spears, however, were but thin poles, hastily prepared, and which bent whenever they struck a rib or a muscle. The wounds they made were not therefore deep, though numerous. At last one of them threw his tomahawk. It struck him upon the cheek, severed his ear, laid bare his skull to the back of his head, and stretched him upon the prairie. The Indians again rushed on, but Higgins, recovering his self-possession, kept them off with his feet and hands. Grasping at length one of their spears, the Indian, in attempting to pull it from him, raised Higgins up, who, taking his rifle, dashed out the brains of the nearest savage. In doing this, however, it broke, the barrel only remaining in his hand. The other Indian, who had heretofore fought with caution, came now manfully into the battle. His character as a warrior was in jeopardy. To have fled from a man thus wounded and disarmed, or to have suffered his victim to escape, would have tarnished his fame forever. Uttering therefore a terrific yell, he rushed on and attempted to stab the exhausted ranger. But the latter warded off his blow with one hand and brandished his rifle barrel with the other. The Indian was as yet unharmed, and, under existing circumstances, by far the most powerful man. Higgins' courage, however, was unexhaustible and inexhaustible. The savage at last began to retreat from the glare of his untamed eye to the spot where he had dropped his rifle. Higgins knew that if he recovered that, his own case was desperate. Throwing, therefore, his rifle barrel aside, and drawing his hunting knife, he rushed upon his foe. A desperate strife ensued. Deep gashes were inflicted on both sides. Higgins, fatigued and exhausted by the loss of blood, was no longer a match for the savage. The latter succeeded in throwing his adversary from him, and went immediately in pursuit of his rifle. Higgins at the same time rose and sought for the gun of the other Indian. Both, therefore, bleeding and out of breath, were in search of arms to renew the combat. The smoke had now passed away, and a large number of Indians were in view. Nothing, it would seem, could now save the gallant ranger. There was, however, an eye to pity and an arm to save, and that arm was a woman's. The little garrison had witnessed the whole combat. It consisted of but 6 men and 1 woman. That woman, however, was a host, a Mrs. Pursley. When she saw Higgins contending single-handed with a whole tribe of savages, she urged the rangers to attempt his rescue. The rangers objected, as the Indians were 10 to 1. Mrs. Pursley, therefore, snatched a rifle from her husband's hand, and declaring that so fine a fellow as Tom Higgins should not be lost for want of help, mounted a horse and sallied forth to his rescue. The men, unwilling to be outdone by a woman, followed at full gallop, reached the spot where Higgins had fainted and fell, before the Indians came up, and while the savage with whom he had been engaged was looking for his rifle, his friends lifted the wounded ranger up, and throwing him across a horse before one of the party, reached the fort in safety. Higgins was insensible for several days, and his life was preserved by continued care. His friends extracted 2 of the balls from his thigh. 2, however, yet remained, one of which gave him a good deal of pain. Hearing afterwards that a physician had settled within a day's ride of him, he determined to go and see him. The physician asked him $50 for the operation. This Higgins flatly refused, saying that it was more than half a year's pension. On reaching home, he found that the exercise of riding had made the ball discernible. He requested his wife, therefore, to hand him his razor. With her assistance, he laid open his thigh until the edge of the razor touched the bullet. Then, inserting his 2 thumbs into the gash, he "flirted it out," as he used to say, without it costing him a cent. The other ball yet remained. It gave him